An interpretation can become a prison. Imagine reading the first chapter of a book and deciding you already know how the entire story ends. There's a strange thing that happens to people. A moment happens. A chapter ends, life moves on, but part of us stays behind. Not physically, mentally, emotionally, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades even. And the strangest part is that most of us don't even realize we're doing it. We think we're responding to our present life, but we're actually responding to a story that's already over. A story that ended a long time ago. A heartbreak, maybe a betrayal, maybe it's a failure. Maybe it was something that someone said to you when you were 12 years old, and somehow it echoes in your head still today. The event ended, people moved on, circumstances changed, but the story remained. And now it quietly shapes how you see yourself, how you see other people, and how you see the future without even noticing. Think about it. How many decisions people make based on something that no longer exists? A person gets rejected once and spends the next 10 years believing they are unvaluable. A businessman fails and suddenly they become someone who isn't good with money. Someone embarrasses themselves in public and starts living as if everyone is constantly juggling them. The event lasts minutes. Story lasts years. Maybe even a lifetime. And that's the power of the stories we tell ourselves. Not because they're true, but because they're familiar. The human mind has a very interesting habit. It would rather cling to familiar than face uncertain future. Craziness. Even that the story might hurt, it might be so painful, but it likes to hold the familiar. Even when it's limiting, even when it's obviously outdated. Because at least it knows, at least it's predictable, at least we've learned how to survive inside it. And survival can become comfortable, not enjoyable, not fulfilling, just familiar. And sometimes we become experts at surviving a chapter that ended years ago. We build an entire identity around it. We tell ourselves, I'm the one who always gets overlooked. I'm the one who can't trust people. And I'm the one who never finishes anything. Or maybe it's, I'm the one who misses my chance. And after repeating those stories enough times, they stop sounding like stories. They start sounding like facts, but they're not facts. They're interpretations. An interpretation can become a prison. Imagine reading the first chapter of a book and deciding you already know how the entire story ends. It would sound ridiculous. Yet, people do this with their lives every day. Something happened. They drew a conclusion. Then they spent years gathering evidence to support the conclusion. Not because it's true, because it's familiar. And the mind loves familiarity, even when familiarity hurts, especially when pain we know feels safer than the possibilities we haven't explored. Maybe that's why change feels so uncomfortable. Not because change is bad, but because change threatens our stories. And the story has become part of our identity. If the story isn't true anymore, then who the heck are we? We're not the rejected one. If we're not the failure, if we're not the victim, if we're not the person who always gets abandoned, then who are we? That's very scary. It's a question that scares me because it requires us to step into the unknown, and most people don't fear failure nearly as much as they fear uncertainty. At least failure feels familiar. At least disappointment is familiar. At least being stuck is familiar. Freedom isn't familiar at all. Growth isn't. Reinvention is not familiar. Those things require us to leave the old story behind. And guess what? Leaving the old story behind, we can feel like losing a piece of ourselves. But maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what's needed. Maybe some identities aren't meant to be carried forever. Think about it. How different you are from the person you were 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, maybe even 1 year ago. You've learned things, lost things, gained things, changed in ways you probably don't even notice. Yet, some people continue to carry labels that no longer serve them, that no longer fit. Like wearing clothes from another season. The label may have made sense once, but it doesn't fit anymore. The story may have protected you once, but now it's restricting you. The problem is that old stories rarely announce themselves. They do not show up saying, hello, I'm an outdated belief. What they do is disguise themselves as reality, as certainty, as common sense, as just the way things are. Is that you? That's why they're so difficult to challenge. Most people never question the stories running in the background. They simply obey them year after year after year, opportunity after opportunity, relationship after relationship. And then one day they wonder why life feels stuck. I don't think it's stuck. Maybe life isn't stuck. Maybe the story is what it is. Maybe the chapter ended years ago, but nobody told the narrator. Here's a question worth asking. What belief about yourself are you still carrying that originated from a version of your life that no longer exists? Take a moment. Think about it. Not what happened, not the event itself. The conclusion you drew, you created from that situation. Because that's where the real influence lives. A failure happens, the conclusion becomes, I always mess things up. And from that point forward, every experience gets filtered through those lenses. Not because it's true, because it's familiar. But what if the conclusion was wrong? Not the event, the conclusion. What if the story you've been carrying and that you created and that you evolved was based on incomplete information? What if you judged the entire movie after watching one scene? And what if you've been defending a version of yourself that no longer exists? Because here's the truth. You are not obligated to remain loyal to old versions of yourself. You are not required to keep believing something simple because you've believed it for a long time. You are allowed to outgrow those stories. You are allowed to revise conclusions, and you are allowed to become someone new. In fact, that's what life demands. Not perfection, not certainty, not constant success. Growth. And growth often begins with a simple realization. The chapter ended. The story doesn't have to continue, but maybe things that holding you back isn't in your past. Maybe it's the meaning you've attached to it. Maybe it's the door that's been open for years, but you've been standing in front of it because the old story convinced you that that door was locked. Or maybe, just maybe, today is the day you recognize the person who needed that story no longer exists. And if that's true, then perhaps the next chapter isn't about fixing yourself. Perhaps it's about finally putting down the story that ended a long time ago and give yourself permission to write the new one. If you want to write a new story, I'm here. Check out the link. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. I appreciate you.